the greatest historical lies about the Jesus narrative. What if everything you thought you knew about one of history's most influential figures was built on a foundation of carefully constructed narratives, borrowed mythologies, and centuries of theological evolution? What if the story that has shaped Western civilization for 2 millennia contains layers of historical distortions that have been accepted as absolute truth? Today, we're embarking on a journey that will challenge some of the most deeply held beliefs in human history. We're going to examine the Jesus narrative not through the lens of faith or devotion, but through the rigorous methodology of historical analysis and archaeological evidence. This isn't about attacking anyone's beliefs or undermining personal faith. This is about separating historical fact from religious doctrine and understanding how one of the world's most powerful stories actually came to be. Before we dive deep, let me be crystal clear about what we're doing here. We're not asking whether Jesus existed as a historical figure. We're not trying to prove or disprove anyone's religious convictions. What we're examining are the specific claims, stories, and narratives that have been woven around this figure over centuries, and how many of these elements can be traced back to much older sources, political motivations, and theological developments that occurred long after any historical Jesus would have lived. The story we're about to unfold spans nearly 3,000 years of human civilization. It takes us from the ancient polytheistic cultures of the Near East, through the rise and fall of empires, into the melting pot of ideas that was the Roman world, and finally to the moment when a collection of diverse beliefs crystallized into what we now recognize as Christianity. But here's what makes this investigation so fascinating and so important. The Jesus narrative, as we know it today, wasn't created in first century Palestine. It was assembled, edited, and refined over centuries by people who had specific theological and political agendas. The stories weren't written by eyewitnesses. The doctrines weren't established by the earliest followers. And many of the most central elements of the narrative can be found in religious traditions that predate Christianity by hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. Let's start with the foundation. When we examine the historical context in which Christianity emerged, we discover something remarkable. The ancient Near East was home to dozens of religious traditions that contained strikingly similar elements to what would later become core Christian beliefs. Virgin births, dying and rising savior gods, sacrificial atonement, divine intercession between humans and the supreme deity. These weren't revolutionary new concepts introduced in first century Palestine. They were well-established religious themes that had been circulating throughout the Mediterranean world for centuries. Consider the Egyptian god Osiris, whose story includes death, resurrection, and the promise of eternal life for his followers. Or Mithras, worshipped throughout the Roman Empire, whose mystery religion included ritualistic consumption of bread and wine representing the god's body and blood. These weren't obscure, forgotten traditions. They were mainstream religious practices that coexisted with early Christian communities in the same cities, sometimes on the same streets. The early Christian writers were acutely aware of these similarities. In fact, they were so troubled by them that they developed an explanation that seems almost comical from a modern perspective. They argued that Satan had deliberately created these earlier religions as counterfeits to undermine the truth of Christianity. The devil, they claimed, had planted false versions of Christian rituals and beliefs in earlier cultures to confuse people when the true Savior finally arrived. This explanation reveals something crucial about the intellectual climate of early Christianity. Rather than acknowledging that their beliefs had evolved from pre-existing religious concepts, the early church fathers insisted on the unique divine origin of their doctrines. This wasn't unusual for religious movements of the time, but it created a historical narrative that obscured the actual development of Christian theology. Now, let's examine how Judaism itself evolved during the centuries leading up to the emergence of Christianity. This is where our story becomes even more complex and fascinating. The Judaism that existed in first-century Palestine was radically different from the Judaism that had existed 500 years earlier. It had been transformed by centuries of foreign occupation, cultural exchange, and theological innovation. The ancient Israelites and Judahites were originally polytheistic peoples, worshipping multiple deities within a divine council headed by Yahweh. Archaeological evidence shows us that the goddess Asherah was worshipped alongside Yahweh well into the monarchic period. The transition to monotheism was a gradual process that occurred primarily during and after the Babylonian exile, influenced heavily by Persian Zoroastrian concepts. This is crucial to understand because it means that many of the theological concepts that would later be attributed to divine revelation were actually the result of cultural contact and religious evolution. The idea of a cosmic battle between good and evil, the concept of an afterlife with rewards and punishments, the notion of a final judgment and resurrection of the dead, these weren't original Jewish concepts. They were borrowed and adapted from Persian Zoroastrianism during the period when Jewish elites lived in Babylonian exile. When these exiled Jews returned to rebuild their temple and reconstitute their society, they brought these new theological concepts with them. This is when we see the emergence of what we might call apocalyptic Judaism, the belief that history was moving toward a climactic confrontation between the forces of good and evil, after which God would establish a new kingdom and resurrect the dead. By the time we reach the 1st century, Palestinian Judaism had fractured into multiple competing sects, each with different interpretations of these theological developments. The Pharisees believed in resurrection and an afterlife. The Sadducees rejected these concepts as foreign innovations. The Essenes went even further, developing elaborate doctrines about predestination, cosmic dualism, and the imminent end of the world. This is the religious landscape into which Christianity emerged. It wasn't a world where monotheistic Judaism stood in stark opposition to pagan polytheism. It was a complex, multicultural environment where religious ideas flowed freely between different traditions, where syncretistic movements combined elements from various sources, and where new religious movements regularly appeared claiming divine revelation. Understanding this context is essential because it reveals how many supposedly unique Christian doctrines were actually variations on themes that were already circulating in contemporary religious thought. The idea of a Messiah who would suffer and die for the sins of others wasn't unprecedented. The concept of divine incarnation wasn't revolutionary. The promise of eternal life through participation in sacred rituals wasn't novel. What was unique about Christianity wasn't its individual theological components, but the particular way these components were combined and the historical circumstances that allowed this particular combination to spread throughout the Roman Empire. The success of Christianity had less to do with the uniqueness of its message and more to do with its adaptability to different cultural contexts and its eventual adoption by imperial authorities. This brings us to one of the most important points in our investigation. The Jesus narrative, as we know it today, wasn't fixed or finalized until centuries after the events it purports to describe. The Gospels weren't written by eyewitnesses. They were composed decades later by Greek-speaking Christians who were attempting to make sense of traditions that had been passed down through oral transmission and had already undergone significant development and modification. Each gospel writer had specific theological goals and addressed particular audiences. They weren't writing objective historical accounts. They were crafting religious literature designed to convince readers of certain theological propositions. This explains why the Gospels contain numerous contradictions, anachronisms, and historically implausible elements. They were never intended to be historical documents in the modern sense. The process of canonization, deciding which writings would be included in the official New Testament, didn't occur until the 4th century. This means that for over 300 years, Christian communities had access to dozens of different Gospels, letters, and other religious writings, many of which contained very different versions of the Jesus story. Some portrayed Jesus as a purely spiritual being who never took physical form. Others described him as a human teacher who was adopted by God at his baptism or resurrection. Still others presented him as one of many divine emanations from an unknowable supreme source. The version that ultimately prevailed, the Jesus who was both fully human and fully divine, who was born of a virgin, who died for human sins and rose from the dead, wasn't chosen because it was more historically accurate than the alternatives. It was selected because it aligned with the theological and political needs of the church leadership in the 4th century, particularly after Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. This process of selection and standardization necessarily involved the suppression of alternative versions of the Jesus story. Entire libraries of early Christian literature were destroyed. Competing theological perspectives were declared heretical. The complex, diverse religious movement that had characterized early Christianity was compressed into a single unified doctrine enforced by imperial authority. What we're seeing here is the difference between history and theology. Historical investigation seeks to understand what actually happened in the past, based on available evidence. Theology seeks to articulate religious truths that may transcend historical particulars. The problem arises when theological claims are presented as historical facts, or when historical investigation is constrained by theological assumptions. The Jesus narrative, as it has been transmitted to us, contains both historical and theological elements, but these have become so intertwined that separating them requires careful analysis of the sources, their contexts, and their development over time. When we undertake this analysis, we discover that many elements of the story that have been accepted as historical facts are actually theological interpretations that developed long after the events they purport to describe. This doesn't necessarily invalidate the religious significance of these stories for believers. Religious truth and historical truth operate in different domains and serve different purposes. But it does mean that we need to be more careful about distinguishing between what we can know historically about 1st century Palestine and what represents later theological reflection on the meaning and significance of those events. As we continue this investigation, we'll be examining specific elements of the Jesus narrative and tracing their origins through the complex web of ancient religious traditions, political circumstances, and theological developments that gave rise to Christianity as we know it today. We'll discover how virgin birth stories functioned in ancient Mediterranean cultures, how dying and rising god myths operated in mystery religions, and how the concept of divine sacrifice for human redemption evolved in various religious contexts. The picture that emerges from this analysis is far more complex and fascinating than the simplified version that has been handed down through traditional religious instruction. It reveals Christianity not as a radical break from previous religious traditions, but as a creative synthesis of existing elements that proved particularly successful in the competitive religious marketplace of the Roman Empire. This synthesis wasn't accidental or inevitable. It was the result of specific historical circumstances, individual choices, and institutional developments that could have unfolded differently under other conditions. Understanding these circumstances helps us appreciate both the human creativity involved in the development of religious traditions and the contingent nature of beliefs that are often presented as eternal and unchanging truths. What makes this historical puzzle even more intriguing is the way certain elements of the Jesus story appear to have been deliberately constructed to fulfill what early Christian writers believed were ancient prophecies. But here's where things get really interesting. Many of these so-called prophecies weren't actually prophecies at all. They were ancient Jewish texts that were being reinterpreted and retrofitted to support theological claims that hadn't even been conceived when those texts were originally written. Take the famous virgin birth narrative, for instance. This doctrine hinges on a single verse from the book of Isaiah that speaks of a young woman giving birth to a child. But when we examine the original Hebrew text, we discover that the word used simply means young woman, not specifically a virgin. It was only when this text was translated into Greek centuries later that the word was rendered in a way that could support a virgin birth interpretation. The original context of the passage had nothing to do with a future Messiah. It was addressing the immediate political situation of 8th century Judah. This pattern repeats throughout what Christians call the Old Testament prophecies about Jesus. Passages that were originally about contemporary events, national restoration, or metaphorical relationships between God and Israel were systematically reinterpreted as predictions about a future divine figure. This was an accidental misunderstanding. It was a deliberate hermeneutical strategy designed to create the appearance of ancient validation for relatively new theological concepts. The political dimensions of this process become even clearer when we examine how Christianity developed under Roman rule. The empire was facing significant challenges in the 2nd and 3rd centuries: economic instability, military pressures on multiple frontiers, and growing social tensions between different cultural groups. Traditional Roman religion, with its emphasis on civic duty and imperial cult worship, was struggling to provide meaning and unity for an increasingly diverse population. Christianity offered something different. It promised personal salvation that transcended ethnic and social boundaries. It provided a sense of cosmic purpose that made individual suffering meaningful. And crucially, it developed organizational structures that could function independently of, and sometimes in opposition to, traditional civic institutions. For people living under the pressures of imperial taxation, military conscription, and social displacement, this was an attractive alternative. But Christianity's success wasn't just due to its appeal to ordinary people. It also attracted intellectuals and social elites who were drawn to its sophisticated theological framework. The early church fathers weren't simple fishermen preaching to peasants, as the traditional narrative sometimes suggests. They were highly educated individuals who had been trained in Greek philosophy, Roman law, and ancient literary traditions. They consciously crafted Christian theology to compete with the most sophisticated intellectual movements of their time. This is where we encounter one of the most significant distortions in the traditional Jesus narrative: the idea that Christianity represented a sharp break from pagan philosophy and culture. In reality, early Christian theology was deeply influenced by Platonic and Stoic philosophical concepts. The notion of a transcendent realm of perfect forms, the idea of the soul's imprisonment in material existence, the concept of divine logos as the organizing principle of the universe, these weren't originally Christian ideas. They were borrowed from Greek philosophical traditions and integrated into Christian doctrine. The influence of Platonic philosophy is particularly evident in how early Christians understood the relationship between the divine and material worlds. Plato had argued that the physical universe was merely a shadow of a higher realm of perfect forms. This concept was adopted by Christian theologians who argued that earthly existence was a fallen state from which souls needed to be redeemed through divine intervention. The material world wasn't inherently evil, as some Gnostic groups believed, but it was certainly inferior to the spiritual realm where God dwelt. This philosophical framework provided a sophisticated intellectual foundation for Christian theology, but it also created tensions with the more concrete historical claims about Jesus. If the material world was merely a shadow of higher spiritual realities, what was the significance of specific historical events? If divine truth was accessible through philosophical contemplation, why was divine incarnation necessary? These questions would plague Christian theology for centuries and lead to increasingly complex doctrinal formulations. The development of Trinitarian doctrine provides a perfect example of how these philosophical influences shaped Christian theology in ways that moved far beyond anything that could be traced back to first-century Palestinian Jewish thought. The idea that God exists as three distinct persons who are nonetheless one divine essence is a highly abstract metaphysical concept that owes more to Platonic theories about the relationship between unity and multiplicity than to any teachings that can be reliably attributed to a historical Jesus. What's particularly fascinating is how this doctrine developed through a series of heated theological controversies that often had as much to do with imperial politics as with religious truth. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, which established the basic framework for Trinitarian doctrine, was convened not by religious authorities, but by the Roman Emperor Constantine. The emperor had recently converted to Christianity and was concerned about theological disputes that were threatening the unity of his empire. Constantine didn't particularly care about the finer points of Christian theology. He was interested in political stability. The theological questions that seemed so crucial to Christian bishops, whether the Son was of the same essence as the Father, or merely similar essence, were largely irrelevant to imperial administration. What mattered was ending the disputes that were creating social unrest and undermining imperial authority. The council's decisions weren't based primarily on historical evidence about what Jesus or his earliest followers actually believed. They were based on theological arguments about what doctrines would best serve the needs of a unified imperial church. Alternative viewpoints weren't rejected because they were historically inaccurate. They were rejected because they threatened ecclesiastical and political unity. This pattern continued through subsequent centuries as Christian doctrine became increasingly systematized and institutionalized. Each generation of church leaders faced new challenges and developed new theological solutions, often claiming that these innovations were simply clarifications of truths that had been implicit in the original Christian message. But when we trace these developments historically, we can see how far the institutional church had moved from whatever religious movement had existed in first century Palestine. The transformation becomes even more dramatic when we examine how Christian ritual and practice evolved. The early Christian communities described in the New Testament appear to have been relatively simple fellowship groups that met in private homes for shared meals and mutual support. But by the 4th century, Christianity had developed elaborate liturgical ceremonies, hierarchical clerical structures, and magnificent architectural complexes that rivaled the grandest pagan temples. This transformation wasn't just a matter of natural growth and development. It represented a fundamental shift in the character of the religious movement. The intimate, egalitarian communities of early Christianity had been replaced by an imperial religion that emphasized authority, orthodoxy, and institutional power. The radical social message that may have characterized the original Jesus movement had been domesticated and channeled into support for existing social hierarchies. Perhaps nowhere is this transformation more evident than in Christianity's relationship with wealth and power. The Gospels contain numerous passages that seem to advocate for economic redistribution, care for the poor, and suspicion of accumulated wealth. Yet by the medieval period, the Christian church had become one of the largest landowners in Europe, and Christian theology had developed sophisticated justifications for social inequality and imperial authority. This wasn't necessarily hypocrisy on the part of individual Christian leaders, though that certainly existed. It was the predictable result of a religious movement becoming integrated into existing power structures. Once Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, it inevitably began to serve imperial interests. Theological doctrines were shaped by political necessities, and radical elements of the original message were either reinterpreted or suppressed. The historical Jesus, if he existed, was almost certainly a figure who would be unrecognizable to most modern Christians. He would have been a Jewish teacher, operating within the complex religious and political context of first century Palestine, addressing concerns and using conceptual frameworks that were specific to that time and place. The cosmic savior figure of later Christian theology represents centuries of theological development that occurred under very different historical circumstances. This doesn't mean that Christianity is somehow illegitimate or that modern believers are wrong to find meaning and value in Christian traditions. Religious movements inevitably evolve and adapt to changing circumstances. What we're examining here isn't the validity of religious faith, but the accuracy of historical claims about how that faith developed. The problem arises when theological doctrines developed centuries after the fact are presented as historical descriptions of first-century events, or when the complex evolution of religious ideas is simplified into a narrative of divine revelation that supposedly occurred at a specific moment in time. This kind of historical distortion makes it impossible to understand either the actual circumstances that gave rise to Christianity or the genuine religious insights that Christian traditions have developed over time. Understanding the real history doesn't diminish the cultural and spiritual significance of Christian traditions. If anything, it reveals the remarkable human creativity and adaptability that has allowed these traditions to survive and flourish across very different historical periods and cultural contexts. The story of how a small Jewish sectarian movement became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, and eventually much of the world, is far more interesting and impressive than any simplified tale of divine intervention. But this real history has been obscured by centuries of theological interpretation that has treated historical development as divine plan and human creativity as divine revelation. Separating these elements requires careful attention to sources, contexts, and the gradual accumulation of changes that can transform religious movements beyond recognition, while maintaining claims of continuity with their origins. As we delve deeper into specific aspects of the Jesus narrative, we'll discover how each element tells a similar story of historical development, cultural borrowing, and theological innovation being presented as timeless, divine truth. The patterns we're uncovering aren't unique to Christianity. They can be found in the development of most religious traditions. But Christianity's particular combination of historical claims and theological doctrines makes it an especially revealing case study in how religious narratives are constructed, transmitted, and transformed across time. The implications of this investigation extend far beyond academic historical inquiry. In a world where religious claims continue to shape political decisions, social policies, and international relations, understanding the actual historical foundations of these claims becomes a matter of practical importance. We need to be able to distinguish between what can be known historically and what represents later theological interpretation, if we're going to make informed decisions about how religious traditions should influence contemporary life. This investigation is far from over. We've only begun to scratch the surface of how the Jesus narrative was constructed and why certain versions of the story prevailed over others. As we continue, we'll be examining specific textual evidence, archaeological findings, and comparative religious materials that illuminate this process in ever greater detail. The web of influences becomes even more intricate when we examine the mystery religions that flourished throughout the Roman Empire during the centuries surrounding Christianity's emergence. These weren't obscure fringe movements practiced in hidden corners of the ancient world. They were mainstream religious traditions that attracted followers from every level of society, including emperors, merchants, soldiers, and slaves. Consider the cult of Mithras, which was particularly popular among Roman military personnel. Mithric temples have been discovered throughout the empire, from Britain to the Black Sea. The religion included initiation ceremonies involving ritual death and rebirth, communal sacred meals where bread and wine represented the god's flesh and blood, and promises of salvation for faithful adherents. The parallels to later Christian practices are unmistakable. Yet Mithraism predates organized Christianity by centuries. The worship of Isis and Osiris, imported from Egypt, offered another template for salvation religion that would profoundly influence Christian development. Isis was portrayed as a compassionate mother figure who interceded with the gods on behalf of human supplicants. Osiris had died, been dismembered, and then resurrected to become judge of the dead and guarantor of eternal life. Devotees participated in elaborate ritual dramas that reenacted these divine events, believing that through sympathetic magic they could share in the god's triumph over death. The Eleusinian mysteries, based in Greece but practiced throughout the Roman world, promised initiates that they would not fear death because they had witnessed the eternal cycle of death and rebirth represented by the story of Demeter and Persephone. These mysteries were so compelling that they attracted participants for over 1,000 years, including many of the most prominent intellectual and political figures of antiquity. What's crucial to understand is that these weren't competing religions in the modern sense. Ancient Mediterranean spirituality was remarkably syncretic. People regularly participated in multiple religious traditions, seeing them as different approaches to similar divine realities rather than mutually exclusive belief systems. A Roman citizen might worship the traditional gods of the state, be initiated into one or more mystery religions, consult oracles and astrologers, and still be open to new spiritual movements that promised additional benefits or insights. This religious marketplace created intense pressure for innovation and adaptation. New movements had to offer something distinctive to attract followers, but they also had to incorporate familiar elements that people could recognize and understand. The genius of early Christianity lay in its ability to synthesize attractive features from multiple traditions while claiming unique divine authorization for the combination. The borrowing wasn't always direct or conscious. Religious ideas spread through cultural osmosis, embedded in art, literature, popular festivals, and everyday conversation. A Christian living in 2nd century Alexandria or Rome would have been surrounded by symbols, stories, and concepts from dozens of different religious traditions. It would have been virtually impossible to develop a purely original theology untouched by this cultural environment. Archaeological evidence provides fascinating glimpses into how this process worked in practice. Christian catacombs contain artwork that draws freely from pagan mythological traditions. Jesus is depicted as Orpheus, the musician who descended into the underworld to retrieve his beloved. Christian sarcophagi show scenes that could equally represent pagan or Christian themes. Early Christian churches were often built on sites previously occupied by pagan temples, sometimes incorporating architectural elements and decorative motifs from the earlier structures. This wasn't necessarily deliberate deception or cynical appropriation. Religious communities throughout the ancient world understood that spiritual truths could be expressed through multiple symbolic systems. They saw connections and parallels between different traditions as evidence of underlying divine realities, not as threats to their particular beliefs. The modern insistence on religious exclusivity and doctrinal purity would have seemed strange and unnecessary to most ancient practitioners. The development of Christian scripture itself reflects this syncretic environment. The New Testament authors wrote in Greek, not Hebrew or Aramaic, and they employed literary techniques and philosophical concepts that were standard in Hellenistic culture. The Gospel of John, in particular, draws heavily on philosophical traditions associated with Plato and the Stoics. Its opening declaration that "in the beginning was the Word" uses the Greek concept of logos, which had been developed by centuries of philosophical speculation about the rational principle underlying cosmic order. Paul's letters, which comprise a significant portion of the New Testament, reveal an author deeply versed in Greek rhetorical techniques, familiar with popular philosophical schools, and comfortable addressing audiences throughout the Roman world. This wasn't a simple fisherman sharing rustic wisdom, as later Christian traditions sometimes portrayed him. This was a sophisticated intellectual who could engage with the most advanced cultural and theological currents of his time. The process of gospel composition itself tells a revealing story about how the Jesus narrative developed. The earliest gospel, Mark, appears to have been written around 70 CE, roughly 4 decades after the events it purports to describe. The author shows clear signs of being unfamiliar with Palestinian geography and Jewish customs, suggesting composition by someone living in the broader Hellenistic world, rather than in the original cultural context of the Jesus movement. Matthew and Luke, written perhaps a decade or 2 later, both used Mark as a source while adding significant new material. Some of this material appears to come from a hypothetical earlier source that scholars call Q, but much of it seems to represent the author's own theological contributions. Each gospel writer had particular concerns and addressed specific communities, which explains why their accounts often contradict each other on crucial details. The Gospel of John, composed perhaps around 90 to 100 CE, presents a Jesus who bears little resemblance to the figure described in the earlier Gospels. This Jesus speaks in long philosophical discourses about abstract theological concepts. He performs more spectacular miracles and makes more explicit claims about his divine status. The evolution from Mark's relatively human figure to John's cosmic Christ reveals how the Jesus narrative was developing and expanding over time. What's particularly significant is that none of these authors claim to have been eyewitnesses to the events they describe. The traditional attributions of gospel authorship to Jesus' disciples are later church traditions that aren't supported by internal textual evidence. The Gospels were written by Greek-speaking Christians living in urban environments quite different from first-century Palestinian villages. They were attempting to reconstruct events and teachings from oral traditions that had already undergone decades of development and modification. This doesn't mean the Gospels contain no historically valuable information, but it does mean we need to read them as religious literature rather than historical documentation. They tell us more about what late 1st century and early 2nd century Christians believed about Jesus than about what actually happened during his lifetime. The theological Christ of the Gospels represents the accumulated faith and reflection of several generations of believers, not the direct testimony of contemporaries. The canonization process that determined which writings would be included in the official New Testament further shaped how the Jesus story would be told. Hundreds of early Christian texts competed for inclusion, many presenting very different versions of Christian origins and theology. The Gospel of Thomas portrayed Jesus as a wisdom teacher whose sayings could unlock divine knowledge. The Gospel of Peter described a docetic Christ whose divine nature was never truly incarnated in human flesh. The Gospel of Mary suggested that women disciples had received special revelations not available to the male apostles. These alternative Gospels weren't excluded because they were historically inaccurate. They were excluded because they represented theological perspectives that the emerging Orthodox Church found threatening or inappropriate. The canonization process was fundamentally about establishing doctrinal boundaries and institutional authority, not about preserving historical truth. The theological framework that emerged from this selection process bore the clear marks of its historical development. The Christ of Orthodox Christianity combined Jewish messianic expectations with Greek philosophical concepts about divine incarnation and Hellenistic mystery religion themes of death and resurrection. This synthesis created a compelling religious narrative, but it was a narrative constructed over several centuries by communities living far removed from the original Palestinian context. The political implications of this development became apparent when Christianity gained imperial support under Constantine in the early 4th century. The emperor wasn't particularly interested in theological subtleties, but he was very interested in religious unity as a tool for political stability. The Council of Nicaea, which he convened in 325 CE, was designed to resolve disputes that were threatening imperial cohesion. The Council's decisions about Christ's divine nature weren't based on historical evidence about what Jesus had actually claimed about himself. They were based on theological arguments about what doctrines would best serve the needs of an imperial church. The winning theological position became orthodox, not because it was more historically accurate, but because it had more powerful political backing. This pattern repeated itself throughout the 4th and 5th centuries as Christian doctrine became increasingly systematized and institutionalized. Each major theological controversy resulted in more elaborate creedal formulations that moved further away from anything that could be traced back to 1st century Palestinian Judaism. The Trinity, the Incarnation, the relationship between Christ's human and divine natures, these became central Christian doctrines not through historical investigation, but through philosophical speculation and political negotiation. The transformation was so complete that by the time Christianity achieved dominance in the Roman Empire, it would have been barely recognizable to any hypothetical first-century followers of Jesus. The simple Jewish sectarian movement had become a sophisticated imperial religion with elaborate liturgies, hierarchical institutions, and complex theological systems that owed as much to Greek philosophy as to Jewish tradition. This institutional Christianity then undertook a systematic effort to rewrite its own history, presenting this centuries-long development as though it had been the intended outcome from the beginning. Alternative versions of Christian origins were suppressed or destroyed. Theological innovations were portrayed as clarifications of truths that had always been implicit in the original message. The complex human process of religious development was transformed into a narrative of divine revelation unfolding according to predetermined plan. The historical Jesus, whatever he may have been like, disappeared beneath layers of theological interpretation and institutional ideology. The carpenter or teacher or prophet who may have lived in first century Palestine was transformed into the cosmic Christ of Imperial Christianity, complete with virgin birth, atoning death, bodily resurrection, and promise of eternal salvation for believers. This transformation wasn't unique to Christianity. Similar processes can be observed in the development of most religious traditions. Founders become mythologized, teachings become systematized, and historical development gets reinterpreted as divine plan. But Christianity's particular combination of historical claims and theological doctrines makes it an especially revealing case study in how religious narratives are constructed and transmitted. The implications extend far beyond academic historical inquiry. Many contemporary political and social conflicts involve competing interpretations of Christian origins and authentic Christian teaching. Understanding the actual historical development of Christian doctrine provides crucial context for evaluating these contemporary debates and distinguishing between what can be known historically and what represents later theological interpretation. Moreover, the historical investigation reveals the remarkable human creativity and adaptability that allowed Christianity to survive and flourish across very different cultural contexts. The story of how a small sectarian movement became a world religion is far more impressive when we understand it as a human achievement rather than simply the result of divine intervention. The patterns we've been examining, the borrowing from earlier traditions, the gradual development of doctrine, the influence of political circumstances, the systematic rewriting of origins, these patterns continue to operate in contemporary religious movements. Understanding how they worked in the case of Christianity provides valuable insights into how religious traditions develop and change over time. And as we continue investigating specific aspects of the Jesus narrative, we'll discover how each major element tells a similar story of historical development, cultural synthesis, and theological innovation being presented as timeless divine revelation. The virgin birth, the resurrection, the atonement, the second coming. Each of these central Christian doctrines has its own complex history that reveals the human fingerprints all over what has been presented as divine truth. The goal isn't to debunk or destroy, but to understand. When we strip away the layers of theological interpretation and institutional ideology, we can begin to see both the historical realities that gave rise to Christianity and the genuine spiritual insights that Christian traditions have developed over time. This understanding doesn't diminish the cultural and spiritual significance of these traditions, but it does provide a more solid foundation for evaluating their contemporary relevance and application. The investigation continues, and the evidence keeps accumulating. Each piece of the puzzle reveals more about how one of history's most influential stories was actually constructed, and why certain versions of that story prevailed over others in the complex cultural marketplace of the ancient Mediterranean world. The deeper we dig into the historical record, the more we discover that many of the most cherished elements of the Jesus narrative weren't original innovations, but rather sophisticated adaptations of much older religious concepts that had been circulating throughout the ancient world for centuries. The virgin birth story provides perhaps the most striking example of how thoroughly Christian doctrine drew from pre-existing mythological traditions. Virgin birth narratives were commonplace in ancient Mediterranean cultures long before Christianity appeared on the scene. The Egyptian god Horus was said to have been born to the virgin goddess Isis after she magically conceived through union with the spirit of her deceased husband Osiris. The Greek hero Perseus was born when the god Zeus impregnated his mother Danae while she was imprisoned in a bronze tower. The Roman god Romulus, legendary founder of Rome, was conceived when the god Mars visited the Vestal Virgin Rhea Silvia. These weren't obscure mythological footnotes. They were well-known stories that shaped how ancient people understood the relationship between divine and human realms. The pattern was so familiar that it had become almost formulaic. Exceptional individuals were born through divine intervention that bypassed normal human reproduction, marking them as chosen vessels for cosmic purposes. When we examine the specific details of the Christian virgin birth narrative, the borrowing becomes even more apparent. The story appears only in 2 of the 4 canonical Gospels, and the accounts in Matthew and Luke contradict each other on crucial details. Matthew presents the story primarily from Joseph's perspective and emphasizes fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. Luke focuses on Mary's experience and includes elaborate scenes with angels and miraculous pregnancies affecting other characters. Neither author appears to have access to eyewitness testimony about these events. Both are writing decades after the supposed occurrences, drawing on oral traditions that had already undergone significant development. More tellingly, both authors seem to be working backward from theological conclusions rather than forward from historical evidence. They needed Jesus to have divine origins, and virgin birth provided a familiar narrative framework for expressing that theological conviction. The prophecy from Isaiah that Matthew cites as validation for the virgin birth reveals another layer of historical distortion. The original Hebrew text refers to an Alma, which simply means a young woman of marriageable age. It carries no implication of virginity. The passage was addressing immediate political circumstances in 8th century Judah, not making predictions about a future Messiah. Only when the text was translated into Greek, centuries later, did the word become Parthenos, which could support a virgin birth interpretation. This pattern of retrofitting ancient texts to support later theological developments appears throughout Christian scriptural interpretation. Passages that originally addressed contemporary political situations, national restoration hopes, or metaphorical relationships between God and Israel were systematically reinterpreted as prophecies about Jesus. This wasn't accidental misunderstanding, but deliberate hermeneutical strategy designed to create the appearance of ancient divine validation for relatively recent theological innovations. The resurrection narrative presents an even more complex case of mythological adaptation and historical distortion. Stories of dying and rising gods were ubiquitous throughout the ancient Near East and Mediterranean world. The Egyptian Osiris died, was dismembered, and then restored to life to become ruler of the underworld. The Greek Dionysus was killed, torn apart, and resurrected to become god of wine and ecstasy. The Mesopotamian Tammuz died each winter and returned each spring, ensuring agricultural fertility. These weren't just abstract mythological concepts. They were enacted in elaborate ritual dramas where participants could experience symbolic death and rebirth, believing they thereby gained access to divine power and immortality. Mystery religions throughout the Roman Empire offered initiation ceremonies that promised adherents they would share in their Savior, God's triumph over death. The Christian resurrection story incorporates elements from all these traditions while claiming unique historical validity. Unlike the cyclical deaths and rebirths of nature gods, Jesus' resurrection was presented as a one-time historical event, that had cosmic significance for all humanity. Unlike the symbolic resurrections of mystery religion initiates, Jesus' return from death was portrayed as literal, physical, and witnessed by multiple people. But when we examine the actual evidence for these claims, the historical foundation proves remarkably thin. The earliest Christian writings, Paul's letters, describe resurrection in largely spiritual terms, without emphasizing physical details. Paul's own account of his conversion experience suggests an encounter with a heavenly vision rather than a resurrected physical body. His theological arguments about resurrection focus on transformation into spiritual existence rather than restoration of material flesh. The gospel accounts of resurrection appearances written decades later show clear signs of legendary development. Each successive gospel adds more elaborate details, more spectacular miracles, and more explicit proofs of physical resurrection. Mark's original ending simply reports an empty tomb and a mysterious young man who announces that Jesus has risen. Matthew adds earthquake, descending angels, and appearances to disciples. Luke includes detailed conversations and Jesus eating food to prove his physical reality. John provides the most elaborate scenes, including Thomas touching Jesus' wounds. This pattern of escalating miraculous claims is exactly what we would expect from developing oral traditions, rather than historical testimony. Each retelling adds new elements designed to address skeptical questions or enhance the story's impact. The progression from spiritual vision to physical resurrection, to elaborate proof narratives, reveals how theological convictions were gradually transformed into historical claims. The gospel writers weren't deliberately fabricating evidence. They were working within ancient biographical conventions that freely mixed historical elements with legendary material designed to reveal deeper truths about their subject's significance. Ancient readers understood these conventions and didn't expect modern standards of historical accuracy. The problem arises when these ancient literary genres are interpreted through contemporary expectations about factual reporting. Archaeological evidence provides virtually no support for the specific historical claims embedded in the resurrection narratives. No contemporary non-Christian sources mention the extraordinary events described in the Gospels. Roman and Jewish historians, who carefully documented other religious movements and political disturbances, make no reference to mass resurrections, earthquakes, or darkness covering the land. The silence is particularly striking, given that some of these sources were actively hostile to Christianity and would have had every reason to mention and refute such spectacular claims if they had been widely circulated. The development of atonement theology reveals another fascinating example of how Christian doctrine synthesized elements from multiple ancient religious traditions. The idea that divine beings could suffer and die to benefit human beings wasn't a Christian innovation. Throughout the ancient world, people understood that God sometimes accepted sacrificial offerings as payment for human wrongdoing, or as means of securing divine favor. Greek tragedy regularly explored themes of innocent suffering that somehow benefited the larger community. The concept of scapegoating, where one individual's punishment removes collective guilt, appears in numerous ancient cultures. Mystery religions promised participants that they could share in their Savior, God's sacrificial death, and thereby gain immunity from divine punishment. Jewish tradition included elaborate sacrificial systems where animal offerings could atone for human sins and restore proper relationship with God. The Day of Atonement ritual involved transferring community guilt to a goat that was then driven into the wilderness, symbolically removing the people's wrongdoing. Temple sacrifices provided regular means for individuals to address their moral failures and ritual impurities. Christian atonement theology combined these various traditions into a new synthesis that claimed to supersede and fulfill all previous sacrificial systems. Jesus became the ultimate sacrifice, whose death provided permanent atonement for all human sin. His suffering wasn't just exemplary or inspirational, but mechanically effective in changing the cosmic relationship between humanity and God. This theological development required several centuries of sophisticated philosophical reflection to reach its mature form. Early Christian communities had various ways of understanding Jesus' death, not all of which emphasized sacrificial atonement. Some saw it primarily as martyrdom that demonstrated faithfulness under persecution. Others interpreted it as cosmic victory over demonic powers that had enslaved humanity. Still others viewed it as revelation of divine love that could transform human hearts and behavior. The specific theory that Jesus' death satisfied divine justice by paying the penalty for human sin developed gradually through interaction with Roman legal concepts, Greek philosophical ideas about moral order, and continued reflection on Jewish sacrificial traditions. This wasn't a doctrine that could be traced directly back to first-century Palestinian Judaism, but rather represented creative theological synthesis that occurred as Christianity spread throughout the Roman world. The political dimensions of atonement theology become apparent when we consider how it functioned within Imperial Christian society. The doctrine provided theological justification for existing social hierarchies by explaining suffering as consequence of universal human sinfulness rather than result of economic exploitation or political oppression. It channeled revolutionary energy into individual spiritual transformation rather than collective social change. The emphasis on substitutionary atonement also reinforced authoritarian church structures by making salvation dependent on proper belief rather than ethical behavior or social justice. Theological orthodoxy became more important than moral character or compassionate action. This shift had profound implications for how Christianity would develop as an institutional religion with significant political power. The eschatological elements of Christian doctrine reveal similar patterns of adaptation from pre-existing religious traditions. Expectations about end times, final judgment, resurrection of the dead, and establishment of divine kingdom weren't original Christian concepts, but had been developing within Jewish apocalyptic movements for several centuries before Christianity emerged. These ideas themselves had been borrowed from Persian Zoroastrian traditions during the period when Jewish elites lived in Babylonian exile. Zoroastrianism included elaborate doctrines about cosmic struggle between good and evil forces, final judgment of all souls, resurrection of the dead, and establishment of renovated world under divine rule. Jewish apocalyptic literature adapted these concepts to fit monotheistic theology and hopes for national restoration. Different Jewish groups developed varying interpretations of these apocalyptic themes. Some expected a political messiah who would restore Davidic monarchy and drive out foreign oppressors. Others anticipated a cosmic judge who would punish the wicked and reward the righteous. Still others looked for a priestly figure who would purify temple worship and establish proper covenant relationship with God. Christian eschatology synthesized elements from all these traditions while adding distinctive features related to Jesus' expected return. The doctrine of the Second Coming promised that Jesus would return to complete the salvation process he had begun during his earthly ministry. This expectation provided hope for persecuted communities, an explanation for why the kingdom of God hadn't been fully established despite Jesus' resurrection. But the specific timing and nature of these future events remained contested throughout early Christian history. Some expected Jesus to return within their own lifetimes. Others developed more elaborate timetables based on symbolic interpretation of biblical numbers. Still others spiritualized the entire eschatological program, arguing that the real transformation occurred within individual hearts rather than in external historical circumstances. The failure of early return expectations created theological problems that required increasingly sophisticated solutions. Each generation of Christians had to explain why Jesus hadn't yet returned, despite apparent promises that his coming was imminent. This led to development of complex theological systems that could accommodate indefinite delay while maintaining hope for eventual fulfillment. The institutional church eventually solved this problem by claiming authority to interpret eschatological expectations in whatever way served contemporary needs. Apocalyptic themes could be emphasized during periods of persecution or social upheaval, then de-emphasized during times when the church enjoyed political power and social stability. The flexibility of eschatological interpretation became a valuable tool for institutional adaptation. These doctrinal developments weren't occurring in theological vacuum, but were shaped by concrete historical circumstances and practical institutional needs. Each major theological controversy reflected underlying social tensions, political conflicts, or cultural changes that required religious response. Theology served not just as abstract speculation about divine nature, but as practical tool for community organization and social control. The Christological controversies of the 4th and 5th centuries provide excellent examples of how theological doctrine developed through political negotiation rather than historical investigation. The questions that generated such intense debate, whether Christ had one nature or two, whether he was of the same essence as the Father or merely similar essence, whether the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father alone or from both Father and Son, these weren't questions that could be answered by examining evidence about first-century Palestine. They were metaphysical speculations that arose from attempting to reconcile conflicting theological traditions that had developed over several centuries. Greek philosophical concepts about the relationship between divine and material existence clashed with Jewish monotheistic convictions. Hellenistic mystery religion themes of divine incarnation conflicted with Jewish expectations about messianic figures. Roman imperial needs for religious unity collided with diverse local traditions that had developed in different cultural contexts. The theological formulations that emerged from these controversies represented political compromises rather than historical discoveries. The winning positions weren't more historically accurate than the alternatives. They were more successful in gaining imperial support and institutional endorsement. Alternative viewpoints weren't refuted through better evidence, but were suppressed through political pressure and ecclesiastical authority. The Council of Nicaea in 325 established the basic framework for Trinitarian doctrine not because the bishops had access to new historical information about Jesus' divine nature, but because Emperor Constantine needed to resolve disputes that were threatening imperial unity. The council's decisions were ratified not through scholarly consensus, but through imperial decree backed by threat of exile for dissenting bishops. This pattern continued through subsequent councils that refined and elaborated Christian doctrine. Each gathering produced more complex theological formulations that moved further away from anything that could be traced back to first-century Palestinian Jewish thought. The accumulated doctrinal system that emerged bore clear marks of its historical development through Greek philosophical speculation, Roman legal reasoning, and imperial political negotiation. The transformation was so complete that by the time Christianity achieved dominance in the Roman Empire, it would have been barely recognizable to any hypothetical early followers of Jesus. The simple Jewish sectarian movement had become a sophisticated imperial religion with elaborate liturgies, hierarchical institutions, and complex theological systems that owed as much to Greek philosophy as to Jewish tradition. This institutional Christianity then undertook systematic effort to rewrite its own history, presenting centuries of theological development as though it represented clarification of truths that had been implicit in the original Christian message from the beginning. Alternative versions of Christian origins were suppressed or destroyed. Complex human processes of religious development were transformed into narratives of divine revelation, unfolding according to predetermined divine plan. The historical Jesus, whatever he may have been like, disappeared beneath layers of theological interpretation and institutional ideology. The teacher or prophet who may have lived in first-century Palestine was transformed into the cosmic Christ of imperial Christianity, complete with virgin birth, atoning death, bodily resurrection, an elaborate doctrinal system that explained his relationship to God the Father and Holy Spirit. The implications of this historical investigation extend far beyond academic curiosity about ancient religious development. Many contemporary political and social conflicts involve competing interpretations of authentic Christian teaching and proper application of Christian principles to modern circumstances. Understanding the actual historical development of Christian doctrine provides crucial context for evaluating these contemporary debates. Moreover, the patterns we've been examining, the borrowing from earlier traditions, the gradual development of doctrine through cultural synthesis, the influence of political circumstances on theological formulation, the systematic rewriting of origins to support later institutional needs, these patterns continue to operate in contemporary religious movements and political ideologies. The goal isn't to undermine religious faith or spiritual insight, but to understand how human communities create meaning, establish authority, and adapt traditional teachings to changing circumstances. When we strip away the layers of theological interpretation and institutional ideology, we can begin to appreciate both the remarkable human creativity involved in religious development and the genuine spiritual insights that religious traditions preserve and transmit across generations. The investigation reveals that the Jesus narrative as we know it today represents one of history's most successful examples of religious synthesis and cultural adaptation. The combination of Jewish messianic expectations, Greek philosophical concepts, Hellenistic mystery religion themes, and Roman imperial organizational structures created a religious system that could appeal to diverse populations while maintaining institutional coherence across vast geographical and cultural distances. Understanding this achievement as human accomplishment rather than simply divine intervention doesn't diminish its significance, but rather enhances our appreciation for the creativity, adaptability, and spiritual insight that allowed Christianity to survive and flourish across very different historical periods and cultural contexts. The story of how a small sectarian movement became a world religion is far more impressive when we understand it as testimony to human religious genius, rather than merely the result of supernatural intervention. As our investigation continues, we'll be examining even more specific aspects of how the Jesus narrative was constructed, why certain versions of the story prevailed over others, and what this reveals about the broader processes through which religious traditions develop, change, and maintain their authority across time. The patterns we're uncovering illuminate not just Christian history, but the fundamental dynamics of how human communities create and sustain the stories that give meaning to their existence. The documentary evidence becomes even more compelling when we examine the specific mechanisms through which Christian doctrines were systematically constructed from pre-existing religious materials. The process wasn't haphazard borrowing, but rather sophisticated theological engineering that combined familiar elements in innovative ways to create maximum appeal across diverse cultural audiences. Take the concept of divine sacrifice, which became absolutely central to Christian theology. Throughout the ancient Mediterranean world, people understood that the gods sometimes demanded payment for human transgressions. But these payment systems varied dramatically between cultures. Greek traditions emphasized honor and shame dynamics where divine punishment restored cosmic balance. Roman practices focused on contractual relationships, where proper offerings secured divine favor. Egyptian mysteries involved death and regeneration cycles that renewed both individual and cosmic order. Jewish sacrificial systems added another layer of complexity with their emphasis on ritual purity, priestly mediation, and covenant relationship maintenance. The Jerusalem temple operated elaborate ceremonies where animal blood could cleanse various forms of contamination and restore proper standing before Yahweh. These weren't just symbolic gestures, but were understood as mechanically effective procedures that actually changed spiritual realities. Christian theologians synthesized all these traditions into a unified theory that claimed to supersede and fulfill every previous sacrificial system. Jesus became simultaneously the perfect sacrifice, the eternal priest, and the divine recipient of the offering. His death satisfied Greek concepts of cosmic justice, Roman ideas about contractual obligation, Egyptian themes of death and regeneration, and Jewish requirements for blood atonement. The synthesis was brilliant precisely because it incorporated familiar elements from multiple traditions while claiming unique divine validation. But this theological construction required several centuries of sophisticated development before reaching its mature form. Early Christian communities understood Jesus' death in various ways that didn't necessarily emphasize substitutionary atonement. Some interpreted it primarily as martyrdom that demonstrated ultimate faithfulness under persecution. Others saw it as cosmic victory over demonic powers that had enslaved humanity since the fall. Still others viewed it as supreme revelation of divine love that could transform human hearts and inspire ethical behavior. The specific theory that Jesus' death satisfied divine justice by paying the penalty for universal human sin developed gradually through sustained interaction with Roman legal concepts, Greek philosophical ideas about moral order, and continued reflection on Jewish temple practices. Early church fathers like Origen, Chrysostom, and Augustine each contributed different elements to this developing synthesis, drawing on their extensive training in classical rhetoric, philosophy, and jurisprudence. This wasn't organic theological evolution, emerging naturally from first-century Palestinian Jewish thought. It was creative intellectual construction that occurred as Christianity spread throughout the cosmopolitan Roman world and encountered sophisticated philosophical traditions that demanded equally sophisticated theological responses. The doctrine that emerged bore clear fingerprints of this Hellenistic development rather than traces of its supposed Palestinian origins. The political implications become even more apparent when we consider how atonement theology functioned within Imperial Christian society. The emphasis on universal human sinfulness provided theological justification for existing social hierarchies by explaining suffering as consequence of moral corruption rather than result of economic exploitation or political oppression. Individual spiritual transformation became more important than collective social change, channeling potentially revolutionary energy into personal religious experience. The doctrine also reinforced authoritarian ecclesiastical structures by making salvation dependent on correct theological belief rather than ethical behavior or compassionate action. Orthodoxy became more crucial than moral character, creating systems where church authorities could maintain power by controlling access to saving knowledge rather than demonstrating superior wisdom or virtue. This shift had profound consequences for how Christianity would function as an institutional religion with significant political influence. The development of Marian theology provides another fascinating case study in how Christian doctrine absorbed and transformed pre-existing religious concepts. The veneration of Mary as divine mother figure drew extensively from goddess worship traditions that had flourished throughout the Mediterranean world for thousands of years before Christianity appeared. Isis, the Egyptian goddess, had been portrayed as compassionate mother who interceded with other deities on behalf of human supplicants. Her temples throughout the Roman Empire attracted devotees who sought her protection during childbirth, healing from illness, and comfort during times of loss. Artistic depictions showed her nursing the infant Horus, creating visual templates that would later be adapted for Christian Madonna and child imagery. Greek and Roman traditions included numerous divine mother figures who combined nurturing qualities with fierce protective power. Demeter ensured agricultural fertility and guided souls through death and rebirth cycles. Cybele offered salvation through participation in elaborate ritual dramas. Diana protected women and children while also serving as patron of the hunt. These weren't abstract theological concepts, but living religious traditions with active worship communities, elaborate festivals, and sophisticated mythological narratives. The transformation of Mary from minor gospel figure to central theological persona required centuries of careful doctrinal development that gradually attributed to her characteristics and functions previously associated with these goddess traditions. Her perpetual virginity, immaculate conception, bodily assumption into heaven, and role as mediatrix of all graces weren't doctrines that could be traced back to first-century Christian sources, but represented theological innovations that addressed practical religious needs within Christian communities. The process reveals how institutional Christianity systematically appropriated and rebranded popular religious practices, rather than simply replacing them with entirely new alternatives. People who had been accustomed to seeking divine feminine intercession could continue doing so within Christian framework. But now their devotions were channeled through ecclesiastical structures that reinforced clerical authority rather than challenging it. This pattern of strategic appropriation extends throughout Christian ritual and ceremonial practice. The timing of Christmas coincides precisely with Roman Saturnalia festivals and celebrations of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun god. Easter incorporates elements from spring fertility celebrations associated with various goddess traditions. Christian baptism adapts ritual washing practices that were common throughout mystery religions. The Eucharist transforms sacred meal traditions that existed in multiple ancient religious contexts. These weren't accidental coincidences, but deliberate pastoral strategies designed to ease the transition from traditional religious practices to Christian alternatives. Church leaders understood that people needed familiar ritual frameworks to make sense of new theological concepts. Rather than demanding complete abandonment of previous practices, they provided Christian versions that satisfied similar psychological and social needs while redirecting religious loyalty toward ecclesiastical institutions. The architectural evidence tells a similar story. Early Christian churches were often built directly on sites previously occupied by pagan temples, sometimes incorporating columns, decorative elements, and even entire structural components from the earlier buildings. This wasn't just practical recycling of available materials, but symbolic demonstration that Christianity had conquered and transformed the spiritual landscape. The basilica form adopted for church construction wasn't derived from Jewish synagogue architecture, but from Roman civic buildings, where imperial authority was exercised and legal proceedings were conducted. The apse where Christian altars were placed corresponded to the location where Roman magistrates would sit when rendering official judgments. The entire spatial organization reinforced hierarchical relationships between clergy and laity that mirrored imperial administrative structures. Even the development of Christian monasticism, which might seem like a distinctively Christian innovation, drew extensively from pre-existing philosophical and religious traditions. Platonic and Stoic schools had long emphasized withdrawal from material concerns in pursuit of spiritual wisdom. Egyptian hermit traditions provided models for individual ascetic practice. Greek philosophical communities offered examples of collective intellectual pursuit organized around shared principles and common property. Christian monastic rules synthesized elements from all these traditions, while adding distinctively Christian theological rationales and institutional structures. The result was a new form of religious life that could appeal to people attracted to philosophical contemplation, ascetic discipline, or communal solidarity, while channeling their energy into support for ecclesiastical authority and orthodox theological development. The transformation of Christian leadership structures reveals another dimension of how the movement adapted to imperial social organization. The earliest Christian communities described in New Testament sources appear to have been relatively egalitarian fellowship groups with flexible, charismatic leadership based on spiritual gifts rather than institutional authority. Women apparently played prominent roles as teachers, prophets, and community organizers. But as Christianity spread throughout the Roman world and began attracting members from higher social classes, it gradually adopted hierarchical organizational patterns that mirrored imperial administrative structures. The development of monarchical episcopate, with single bishops exercising authority over geographic territories, followed Roman governmental models rather than Jewish religious precedents or early Christian practices. The elaboration of clerical orders, liturgical ceremonies, and ecclesiastical law created increasingly complex institutional machinery that required specialized training and bureaucratic expertise to operate effectively. This professionalization of Christian leadership naturally excluded most women and lower-class men, while concentrating power in the hands of educated elites who could navigate both theological complexities and political relationships. The doctrinal justifications developed for these institutional changes consistently appealed to supposed apostolic precedent and divine authorization, rather than acknowledging their historical development through adaptation to Roman imperial structures. The fiction of unchanging apostolic tradition provided legitimacy for innovations that represented significant departures from whatever organizational patterns may have characterized earliest Christian communities. The process reached its culmination when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, and church leaders began exercising governmental authority directly. Bishops became imperial officials responsible not just for spiritual oversight, but for civil administration, legal proceedings, and economic regulation. The transformation from persecuted minority to imperial establishment required fundamental reconceptualization of Christian identity and purpose. The theological adjustments necessary to accommodate this new role involved systematic reinterpretation of earlier Christian teachings about wealth, power, and social relationships. Passages that seemed to advocate economic redistribution were spiritualized or relegated to future eschatological fulfillment. Sayings that appeared to criticize imperial authority were explained as referring to spiritual rather than political kingdoms. The radical social implications of early Christian teaching were domesticated and channeled into support for existing hierarchical structures. This wasn't necessarily conscious betrayal of original Christian principles by cynical church leaders, though individual corruption certainly occurred. It was the predictable result of any religious movement becoming integrated into existing power structures. Once Christianity achieved imperial status, it inevitably began serving imperial interests, and theological doctrines were shaped accordingly. The historical Jesus, if he existed, almost certainly would have been appalled by what Christianity had become by the 4th century. The movement that may have originated as a Jewish renewal group emphasizing social justice, economic sharing, and resistance to imperial oppression had been transformed into a sophisticated imperial religion that provided theological justification for the very systems of exploitation and domination it may originally have challenged. But understanding this transformation as historical development rather than divine plan doesn't necessarily diminish the spiritual insights that Christian traditions have preserved and transmitted across centuries. Religious movements inevitably evolve and adapt to changing circumstances. The question isn't whether this adaptation occurred, but whether we can distinguish between elements that represent genuine spiritual wisdom and elements that serve primarily institutional or political purposes. The investigation we've been conducting reveals that virtually every major element of the Jesus narrative shows clear evidence of historical construction, cultural borrowing, and theological innovation. The virgin birth, the resurrection, the atonement, the Trinity, the second coming. None of these central Christian doctrines can be traced back to first-century Palestinian Jewish sources without significant distortion of the historical evidence. This doesn't mean that Christianity is somehow illegitimate, or that modern believers are wrong to find meaning and value in Christian traditions. Religious truth and historical truth operate in different domains and serve different purposes. But it does mean that claims about historical accuracy need to be evaluated according to historical standards rather than theological assumptions. The patterns we've uncovered aren't unique to Christianity. Similar processes of mythologization, doctrinal development, and historical reconstruction can be found in the evolution of most religious traditions. Buddhism, Islam, Hinduism and Judaism have all undergone comparable transformations that have obscured their historical origins beneath layers of theological interpretation and institutional ideology. But Christianity's particular combination of historical claims and theological doctrines makes it an especially revealing case study in how religious narratives are constructed, transmitted, and maintained across time. The insistence that Christian doctrines represent historical facts rather than theological interpretations has created unique tensions between faith and scholarship that illuminate broader questions about the relationship between religious belief and historical understanding. The investigation also reveals the remarkable human creativity and adaptability that has allowed Christian traditions to survive and flourish across vastly different historical periods and cultural contexts. The synthesis of Jewish, Greek, Roman, and various other cultural elements into a coherent religious system represents one of history's most impressive examples of cultural innovation and institutional development. Understanding this achievement as human accomplishment rather than divine intervention doesn't diminish its significance, but rather enhances our appreciation for the intellectual, spiritual, and organizational capabilities that human communities can develop when facing existential challenges. The story of how a small sectarian movement became a world religion is far more remarkable when we understand it as testimony to human religious genius, rather than merely the result of supernatural intervention. As we approach the conclusion of this investigation, we need to consider what these findings mean for contemporary discussions about Christian origins, biblical authority, and religious truth claims. The historical evidence clearly demonstrates that the Jesus narrative as traditionally understood represents theological construction rather than historical documentation. This doesn't resolve questions about religious meaning, but it does clarify what kinds of questions historical investigation can and cannot answer. The evidence also suggests that many contemporary debates about authentic Christian teaching and proper interpretation of Christian principles are based on historically inaccurate assumptions about Christian origins. Understanding the actual historical development of Christian doctrine provides crucial context for evaluating competing claims about what Christianity originally taught and how those teachings should be applied to modern circumstances. Perhaps most importantly, the investigation reveals that religious traditions are far more flexible and adaptive than their institutional guardians often acknowledge. The capacity for creative reinterpretation and innovative synthesis that characterized early Christian development continues to operate in contemporary religious communities, even when it's not explicitly recognized or officially sanctioned. The Jesus narrative, whatever its historical limitations, has demonstrated remarkable power to inspire moral transformation, social reform, artistic creativity, and spiritual insight across diverse cultural contexts and historical periods. Understanding how this narrative was constructed doesn't eliminate its capacity to generate meaning, but it does provide better tools for distinguishing between elements that serve genuine spiritual purposes and elements that primarily support institutional authority or political agendas. The investigation continues, and each new piece of evidence adds to our understanding of how one of history's most influential stories was actually created, transmitted, and transformed across time. The implications extend far beyond academic historical inquiry into fundamental questions about how human communities create and sustain the narratives that give meaning to their existence. The web of interconnections becomes even more intricate when we examine how Christian theological concepts were systematically borrowed and adapted from the sophisticated philosophical schools that dominated intellectual life throughout the Roman Empire. The process wasn't random cultural osmosis, but deliberate intellectual appropriation carried out by highly educated church fathers who had been trained in the very philosophical traditions they were attempting to supplant. Consider how the concept of the divine logos, which became central to Christian understanding of Christ's nature, was lifted almost entirely from centuries of Greek philosophical speculation. The Stoics had developed elaborate theories about the logos as the rational principle underlying cosmic order, the divine reason that governed natural law and human ethics. Philo of Alexandria had already begun synthesizing this Greek concept with Jewish theology, arguing that the Logos served as God's primary agent in creating and sustaining the universe. When the author of John's Gospel declared that "in the beginning was the Word," he wasn't introducing a revolutionary new concept, but was employing a sophisticated philosophical framework that his educated readers would immediately recognize. The innovation lay not in the concept itself, but in the claim that this eternal Logos had become incarnate in a specific historical individual. This was philosophical audacity of the highest order, combining abstract metaphysical speculation with concrete historical assertion in ways that previous thinkers had never attempted. The early church fathers who developed Trinitarian doctrine drew even more extensively from Platonic theories about the relationship between unity and multiplicity, between the transcendent one and its various emanations or expressions. The elaborate theological formulations about three persons sharing one divine essence owed far more to centuries of Platonic philosophical reflection than to anything that could be traced back to first-century Palestinian Jewish thought. This wasn't accidental borrowing or unconscious influence. These were sophisticated intellectuals who had been trained in the philosophical schools before converting to Christianity. They consciously employed the most advanced theoretical frameworks available to articulate their new religious convictions, creating theological syntheses that could compete with the best philosophical thinking of their time. The political implications of this intellectual strategy become apparent when we consider how it functioned within the broader cultural competition for educated converts throughout the Roman Empire. Christianity wasn't just competing with traditional civic religions or mystery cults for adherents. It was competing with sophisticated philosophical schools that attracted intellectually serious people seeking comprehensive worldviews that could address ultimate questions about reality, knowledge, and ethics. By incorporating and reinterpreting the most compelling insights from these philosophical traditions, Christian theologians created intellectual frameworks that could satisfy the theoretical demands of educated audiences while maintaining claims about unique divine revelation. The result was a religious system that appeared both philosophically sophisticated and divinely authorized, combining rational credibility with supernatural validation. This synthesis required systematic distortion of both Christian and philosophical sources. Early Christian teachings that emphasized practical ethics, social justice, and community solidarity were increasingly subordinated to abstract theological speculation about divine nature and cosmic relationships. Greek philosophical insights about rational inquiry, critical thinking, and intellectual humility were transformed into support for ecclesiastical authority and doctrinal orthodoxy. The transformation reveals how intellectual traditions can be co-opted and repurposed to serve institutional agendas quite different from their original purposes. The philosophical concepts that had been developed to encourage independent thinking and ethical reflection were redeployed to reinforce religious conformity and clerical control. The Christian teachings that may have originally challenged social hierarchies were redirected to support the very power structures they had once questioned. Perhaps nowhere is this pattern more evident than in how Christian theologians handled the persistent problem of evil and suffering. Traditional Jewish theology had struggled with questions about why a benevolent God would permit innocent suffering, often resolving the tension through appeals to divine mystery or expectations of future vindication. Greek philosophical schools had developed various approaches to the problem, from Stoic acceptance of natural necessity to Platonic theories about the soul's education through material experience. Christian theology created a new synthesis that combined Jewish concepts of divine justice with Greek ideas about cosmic dualism and Persian notions of supernatural conflict between good and evil forces. The result was an elaborate theodicy that explained suffering as consequence of primordial human rebellion against divine authority, cosmic battle between God and Satan, and temporary testing that would ultimately serve divine purposes. This theological construction required extensive reinterpretation of earlier Jewish texts that had never been intended to support such elaborate metaphysical speculation. The story of Adam and Eve, which had originally functioned as mythological explanation for human mortality and agricultural labor, was transformed into doctrine of original sin that supposedly infected all subsequent human beings with inherited guilt and spiritual corruption. The serpent in the garden, which had been simply a clever animal in the original narrative, became Satan, a supernatural entity engaged in cosmic rebellion against divine authority. The tree of knowledge, which had represented the dangerous allure of moral autonomy, became symbol of human pride and disobedience that had corrupted the entire natural order. These weren't natural developments of Jewish theological reflection, but represented fundamental reinterpretation of Jewish sources through Greek philosophical categories and Persian dualistic concepts. The synthesis created compelling explanations for universal human experiences of guilt, suffering, and moral conflict. But it did so by imposing foreign conceptual frameworks on texts that had been written within very different cultural contexts. The doctrine of original sin, in particular, solved several theological problems while creating others. It explained why all human beings seem to struggle with moral failure despite possessing rational capabilities for ethical behavior. It justified the need for divine intervention in human affairs through incarnation and atonement. It provided theological foundation for ecclesiastical authority by making salvation dependent on participation in church-administered sacraments. But the doctrine also created profound tensions with Jewish concepts of human dignity, moral responsibility, and divine justice that had been central to earlier biblical traditions. The idea that infants were born already corrupted by inherited sin contradicted Jewish understanding of human nature and divine compassion. The notion that human beings were incapable of genuine moral improvement through their own efforts undermined Jewish emphasis on ethical education and spiritual discipline. These tensions weren't resolved through better historical understanding or more careful textual analysis, but through increasingly elaborate theological formulations that moved further and further away from the original cultural context in which biblical texts had been produced. Each generation of Christian theologians inherited problems created by previous theological innovations and solved them by creating new doctrinal complexities that generated additional difficulties for subsequent generations. The cumulative result was a theological system of extraordinary sophistication and internal coherence that bore little resemblance to the religious traditions from which it claimed to derive. The Jewish sectarian movement that may have given rise to Christianity had been transformed into something that would have been barely recognizable to its supposed founders, complete with metaphysical speculations about divine nature, cosmic theories about supernatural conflict, and institutional structures that rivaled the complexity of imperial administration. The systematic nature of this transformation becomes even more apparent when we examine how Christian theologians handled specific textual and historical problems that threatened their developing doctrinal system. Each challenge was met not with historical investigation or textual criticism, but with increasingly creative interpretive strategies that could reconcile conflicting evidence with predetermined theological conclusions. When gospel accounts contradicted each other on basic biographical details about Jesus, church fathers developed theories of complementary perspectives rather than acknowledging that the authors were working from different and sometimes incompatible sources. When Old Testament passages failed to support Christian theological claims, they employed allegorical interpretation that could extract whatever meanings served contemporary doctrinal needs, regardless of original context or authorial intention. When archaeological and historical evidence contradicted biblical narratives, church authorities simply declared such evidence irrelevant to spiritual truth, or claimed that divine purposes sometimes required miraculous suspension of natural processes. The strategy was brilliant in its comprehensiveness, any evidence that supported Christian claims validated the faith, while any evidence that challenged Christian claims was dismissed as spiritually insignificant or satanically inspired. This hermeneutical approach created self-reinforcing interpretive systems that were effectively immune to disconfirmation through empirical investigation. Christian doctrine could accommodate virtually any historical discovery or textual analysis by adjusting interpretive frameworks rather than modifying theological conclusions. The system was designed to preserve core doctrinal commitments, regardless of what evidence might emerge from historical or archaeological research. The intellectual consequences of this approach extended far beyond theological speculation into broader questions about the relationship between religious authority and rational inquiry. By establishing doctrine as the primary criterion for evaluating evidence, rather than allowing evidence to shape doctrinal conclusions, Christian institutional authorities created precedents that would influence Western intellectual culture for over a millennium. The suppression of alternative Christian traditions provides perhaps the clearest example of how institutional power was used to enforce particular interpretive frameworks while eliminating competing perspectives. The diversity that had characterized early Christian communities was systematically reduced to a single orthodox position that claimed exclusive access to authentic Christian teaching. Gnostic Christians, who emphasized direct spiritual experience over institutional authority, were condemned as heretics and their writings destroyed. Adoptionist Christians who viewed Jesus as inspired human teacher rather than divine incarnation were excommunicated and persecuted. Arian Christians who maintained strict monotheism while acknowledging Christ's special relationship to God were declared enemies of the faith and driven into exile. Each of these alternative traditions preserved different aspects of what may have been authentic early Christian diversity, but all were eliminated in favor of theological formulations that served the institutional and political needs of an imperial church. The process wasn't driven by superior historical evidence or more convincing theological arguments, but by raw power exercised through imperial authority and ecclesiastical machinery. The victorious Orthodox position then rewrote Christian history to present this institutional triumph as inevitable outcome of theological truth prevailing over heretical error. Alternative traditions were portrayed not as legitimate expressions of Christian diversity, but as corruptions of originally pure doctrine that had been successfully purged from authentic Christian community. This historical revision obscured the complex processes through which Christian doctrine had actually developed, while creating the impression that Orthodox theology represented unbroken continuity with apostolic teaching. The fiction of unchanging tradition provided legitimacy for innovations that actually represented significant departures from whatever religious movement had existed in first-century Palestine. The pattern established during these formative centuries continued to operate throughout subsequent Christian history, as institutional authorities consistently subordinated historical investigation to doctrinal preservation. Each new challenge to established teaching was met with refined apologetic strategies, rather than serious reconsideration of theological premises based on available evidence. The cumulative effect was to create religious cultures that valued doctrinal conformity over intellectual curiosity, theological certainty over historical accuracy, and institutional loyalty over independent critical thinking. These priorities profoundly shaped how Christian communities approached questions about their own origins and development, creating systematic barriers to honest historical investigation that persist in many quarters even today. Understanding this historical development doesn't require us to dismiss the genuine spiritual insights that Christian traditions have preserved and transmitted across centuries. Religious movements inevitably evolve and adapt to changing circumstances, and the capacity for creative reinterpretation has allowed Christianity to address human needs across vastly different cultural contexts and historical periods. But it does require us to distinguish more carefully between what can be known historically about Christian origins and what represents later theological interpretation. The Jesus narrative, as traditionally understood, combines historical memories, legendary development, theological reflection, and institutional ideology in ways that make it impossible to extract simple factual claims about first-century events. The investigation reveals that virtually every major element of traditional Christian teaching shows clear evidence of historical development, cultural borrowing, and theological innovation. The virgin birth stories, resurrection accounts, atonement theories, Trinitarian formulations, and eschatological expectations all reflect complex processes of religious evolution that occurred over several centuries rather than direct transmission of apostolic teaching. This doesn't invalidate the cultural and spiritual significance of these traditions for contemporary believers, but it does mean that historical accuracy cannot be claimed as validation for theological positions that actually developed through very different processes. Religious truth and historical truth operate according to different criteria and serve different purposes within human experience. The patterns we've been examining also illuminate broader questions about how religious traditions develop, maintain authority, and adapt to changing circumstances. The systematic rewriting of origins, the creative appropriation of pre-existing cultural materials, and the gradual transformation of teachings to serve institutional needs aren't unique to Christianity, but can be observed in the evolution of most religious movements. Understanding these processes provides valuable tools for evaluating contemporary religious claims and distinguishing between elements that serve genuine spiritual purposes and elements that primarily support institutional authority or political agendas. The capacity for critical historical analysis doesn't undermine authentic religious experience, but does help identify when religious language is being used to manipulate rather than illuminate human understanding. The Jesus narrative, whatever its historical limitations, has demonstrated remarkable power to inspire moral transformation, social reform, artistic creativity, and spiritual insight across diverse cultural contexts and historical periods. This capacity doesn't depend on historical accuracy, but rather reflects the narrative's ability to address fundamental human concerns about meaning, mortality, justice, and transcendence. The investigation we've conducted reveals both the human creativity involved in constructing this influential story and the institutional mechanisms used to maintain its authority across time. Neither dimension invalidates the other, but understanding both provides more solid foundation for appreciating what religious traditions can and cannot offer to contemporary human experience. As we draw this investigation toward its conclusion, the evidence points unmistakably toward a single conclusion. The Jesus narrative, as traditionally understood, represents one of history's most sophisticated examples of religious construction rather than historical documentation. This construction drew from multiple ancient traditions, evolved through centuries of theological development, and was preserved through institutional mechanisms that prioritize doctrinal consistency over historical accuracy. The implications extend far beyond academic historical inquiry into fundamental questions about religious authority, textual interpretation, and the relationship between faith and evidence. Understanding how the Jesus narrative was actually constructed provides essential context for contemporary discussions about Christian origins, biblical authority, and religious truth claims. The patterns we've uncovered also reveal the remarkable adaptability and creative synthesis that has allowed Christian traditions to survive and flourish across vastly different historical and cultural contexts. This achievement represents human religious genius of the highest order, deserving appreciation and study regardless of questions about historical accuracy or theological validity. The story continues to unfold as new archaeological discoveries, textual analyses, and comparative religious studies add to our understanding of how one of history's most influential narratives came to be. Each piece of evidence contributes to a clearer picture of the complex human processes through which religious traditions develop, change, and maintain their authority across time and circumstance. The systematic nature of this construction becomes even more apparent when we examine the specific literary techniques employed by the Gospel writers to create the impression of historical authenticity while actually crafting theological narratives. These authors weren't primitive storytellers working with crude oral traditions. They were sophisticated writers trained in Hellenistic biographical conventions who understood exactly how to blend historical plausibility with legendary material to maximum effect. The Gospel of Mark, generally considered the earliest, employs what scholars call the messianic secret motif throughout its narrative. Jesus repeatedly tells people not to reveal his identity, creating dramatic tension while also explaining why there was no widespread recognition of his supposed divine status during his lifetime. This literary device solved a crucial problem. If Jesus had really performed spectacular miracles and claimed divine authority, why hadn't this generated more contemporary documentation and recognition? The messianic secret provided an elegant narrative solution that made the lack of historical evidence into proof of the story's authenticity. The absence of contemporary recognition wasn't evidence against Jesus' divine status, but rather confirmation that he had deliberately concealed it during his earthly ministry. This kind of sophisticated literary construction reveals authors who understood the historical problems their narratives needed to address and crafted their stories accordingly. Luke's Gospel demonstrates even more elaborate literary engineering in its famous genealogy, which traces Jesus' lineage back to Adam himself. This wasn't historical documentation, but theological argument presented in genealogical form. By connecting Jesus to the first human being, Luke was making claims about cosmic significance and universal salvation that had nothing to do with actual family records. The genealogy served as a literary device to establish Jesus' credentials within Jewish messianic expectations, while simultaneously extending his relevance to all humanity. The contradictions between Luke's genealogy and Matthew's version weren't accidental errors, but reflected different theological purposes. Matthew traced descent through the royal line of David to emphasize Jesus' credentials as Jewish Messiah. Luke traced descent through different ancestral lines to emphasize Jesus' role as universal savior. Neither author was attempting historical reconstruction. Both were crafting theological arguments using genealogical formats that their audiences would recognize and understand. The birth narratives provide perhaps the clearest examples of how theological convictions were transformed into pseudo-historical accounts. The stories appear only in Matthew and Luke, were written decades after the supposed events, and contradict each other on virtually every concrete detail. Matthew has the family living in Bethlehem originally, then fleeing to Egypt, then settling in Nazareth. Luke has them living in Nazareth originally, traveling to Bethlehem for a census, then returning to Nazareth. These aren't minor discrepancies that could be reconciled through careful harmonization. They represent fundamentally different narrative frameworks that cannot be combined into coherent historical sequence. The authors weren't working from common historical sources, but were independently creating stories that would establish Jesus' birth in Bethlehem to fulfill supposed messianic prophecies while explaining his association with Nazareth. The census that Luke uses to get the family to Bethlehem presents particularly glaring historical problems. No Roman census required people to travel to ancestral birthplaces rather than current residences. Such a system would have created administrative chaos throughout the empire and served no practical purpose for taxation or population counting. Luke's census is literary fiction designed to solve a narrative problem, not historical documentation of imperial policy. The slaughter of innocents that Matthew describes to explain the family's flight to Egypt also lacks any historical foundation. Herod the Great was indeed a brutal ruler who killed perceived threats to his power, including members of his own family. But the massacre of infants in Bethlehem isn't mentioned by any contemporary historian, including Josephus, who documented Herod's other atrocities in considerable detail. The story serves Matthew's theological purposes by connecting Jesus to Moses, who also escaped infanticide, but it has no basis in historical evidence. These narrative constructions weren't deceptions intended to mislead readers, but were standard techniques in ancient biographical writing. Authors regularly included legendary material, symbolic events, and theological interpretations alongside whatever historical information they possessed. Ancient audiences understood these literary conventions and didn't expect modern standards of factual accuracy. The problem arises when these ancient literary genres are interpreted through contemporary assumptions about historical documentation. What the original authors intended as theological biography gets transformed into factual reporting, creating expectations that the texts were never designed to meet and cannot satisfy when subjected to historical analysis. The resurrection narratives demonstrate this pattern with particular clarity. Each gospel presents increasingly elaborate accounts of post-crucifixion appearances, with Mark's original ending simply reporting an empty tomb and a young man's announcement that Jesus had risen. Matthew adds earthquake, descending angel, and appearances to the women and disciples. Luke includes detailed conversations and Jesus eating food to prove his physical reality. John provides the most developed scenes, including Thomas touching Jesus' wounds and extended theological discussions. This progression from minimal claim to elaborate proof narratives reveals legendary development rather than historical testimony. Each successive author felt compelled to add more convincing details to address skeptical questions and enhance the story's impact. The pattern is exactly what we would expect from oral traditions that were growing and developing, rather than from eyewitness accounts that were being faithfully preserved. The geographical and cultural details in the Gospels provide additional evidence of their distance from the original Palestinian context. Mark, supposedly based on Peter's testimony, shows unfamiliarity with basic Palestinian geography, describing impossible travel routes and mislocating cities. The author appears to be writing for audiences outside Palestine who wouldn't recognize these geographical errors. Luke's cultural references reveal similar distance from the original Jewish context. His descriptions of Jewish customs, religious practices, and social relationships often reflect Hellenistic assumptions rather than Palestinian realities. The author was apparently more familiar with diaspora Judaism as practiced in Greek-speaking cities than with the specific cultural environment of first-century Palestine. These aren't minor technical errors that could be dismissed as scribal mistakes or translation problems. They reveal authors who were writing about a cultural and geographical context they knew primarily through second-hand sources rather than direct experience. The Gospels tell us more about the beliefs and concerns of late first century and early second century Christian communities than about the historical realities of Jesus' actual lifetime. The linguistic evidence points in the same direction. Jesus, if he existed, would have spoken Aramaic in daily conversation, possibly some Hebrew in religious contexts, and perhaps limited Greek for commercial interactions. But the Gospels preserve very few Aramaic phrases, and those that appear are often incorrectly translated or contextually inappropriate. The authors were clearly more comfortable with Greek than with the Semitic languages that would have been used in first-century Palestine. The theological sophistication of the sayings attributed to Jesus also reflects later development rather than original teaching. The elaborate discourses in John's Gospel employ abstract philosophical concepts that weren't characteristic of first-century Jewish religious thought, but were common in Hellenistic religious and philosophical circles. These aren't the simple parables and ethical teachings that might be expected from a Jewish teacher addressing Palestinian audiences. Even the Synoptic Gospels contain sayings that appear to reflect concerns and controversies that developed within early Christian communities, rather than issues that would have been relevant during Jesus' supposed lifetime. Debates about Gentile inclusion, ritual requirements, and community organization reveal the practical problems that Christian groups were facing decades after the events the Gospels purport to describe. What we've uncovered through this investigation isn't just an academic exercise in historical criticism. It's a fundamental revelation about how human communities construct the narratives that shape entire civilizations. The Jesus story, as we know it today, stands as perhaps history's most successful example of mythological engineering, a masterwork of cultural synthesis that combined Jewish messianic hopes, Greek philosophical sophistication, Roman imperial organization, and countless other religious traditions into a coherent system that could transcend ethnic boundaries and survive across millennia. This doesn't diminish the genuine spiritual insights that Christian traditions have preserved, nor does it invalidate the moral transformation and social reform that these narratives have inspired throughout history. Instead, it reveals something far more remarkable: the extraordinary human capacity for religious creativity and institutional adaptation. Understanding how the Jesus narrative was actually constructed provides us with essential tools for navigating our contemporary world, where religious claims continue to influence politics, shape social policies, and drive international conflicts. The investigation continues as new archaeological discoveries and textual analyses emerge, but the pattern is clear. When we peel back the layers of theological interpretation and institutional ideology, we discover not divine revelation, but human genius. The remarkable story of how a small sectarian movement became the foundation for Western civilization itself. And perhaps that's the most impressive miracle of all.